Okay, thanks everybody for joining me today. My name is John Laffey, and in this webinar we're going to be talking about risk assessment and treatment considerations for your information security management system. A few notes before we get started. All participants have been muted, but please feel free throughout the presentation to use the Q&A section of the dashboard to go ahead and ask any questions you may have. And at the end of the session, I will answer as many questions as I can. Additionally, there'll be a copy of today's presentation available for download probably by tomorrow. And you'll be able to find that at our website, pjr.com, under previously recorded webinars. Additionally, we also have a YouTube channel where recordings of these broadcasts will be published. You can search for Perry Johnson on YouTube to find that channel. Okay, today we're going to be looking at establishing your context, approach, and criteria for risk management, and then risk identification, analysis, and evaluation. We'll spend some time talking about risk treatment options and selecting a risk treatment, as well as implementing risk treatment plans and evaluating levels of residual risk, and then finally assessing the overall effectiveness of the treatment implemented. And then again, after that, we'll spend some time to answer any questions you may have had. All right. So the internal and external context of your organization and the scope of your ISMS will be the key drivers in determining what criteria will be needed for your risk evaluation, impact, and risk acceptance. As an example, contractual or regulatory requirements could definitely have a large influence on what your risk acceptance criteria will be. And the risk assessment process should be reflective of the industry sector and the risk related to your organization, as well as expectations of stakeholders and the current threat landscape. There are a number of different approaches to information security risk management. The standard does not prescribe that a particular one be used. What the standard does require is that assessments be performed at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed to occur. Additionally, the standard does not specify what the risk acceptance criteria should be. It only requires that it is established and maintained. Lastly, the standard also requires that the risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information be identified. So when we talk about risks in the context of this standard, those are the specific risks we're talking about. Risk identification. So the standard requires, again, that those risks we just spoke about be identified, which can be or seem to be an overwhelming task, especially if no formal approach has been planned for guiding the process. Again, the standard does not require a specific approach be used, but just for demonstrative purposes, I will outline a commonly used method for assisting you with this task. And again, this is not in any way implying that this method is most effective or should be the method chosen by you or your organization. Again, it was just to help demonstrate the different steps of the risk assessment and treatment process. Okay, so in this method, the first step is to identify assets that are within the scope of your system. Keeping in mind that assets are not just hardware and software, but anything of value to the organization. For this example, we'll assume that there are primary assets, which would be business processes and information, and supporting assets, which would be things like hardware, software, network, personnel, sites, organizational structure. By identifying the primary assets, which are those critical business processes or information in the scope of your system, you can then more easily identify the supporting assets, which could affect the confidentiality, integrity, and or availability of those primary assets. You're going to want to identify an asset owner for those assets, and this should be the person most appropriate for being responsible and accountable for the asset. In many cases, the asset owner is also the best person to determine the asset's value to the organization. Next, you want to identify threats to those primary and supporting assets, keeping in mind threats may be accidental or deliberate, and of natural or human origin. To ensure a comprehensive list is created as well as limit the magnitude of work, you may want to consider using generic threat types such as unauthorized access, physical damage, or technical failure, etc. And then where there are specific individual threats of a certain type that warrant explicit identification, make sure you go through that process. Factors that would influence if a specific threat should be identified would include the criticality of the asset they are associated with, as well as the level of damage they could cause if realized. When determining your threats, please consider soliciting input from as many resources as you are able to. These could include asset owners, users, related staff members, legal departments, legal bodies, physical and informational security specialists, etc. The more complete threat listing you can generate, the more informed and protected you can be. Next, you're going to want to identify any existing controls that are already in place. This step may just be a simple review of existing documentation of controls that your organization already has in place. Or if this is the first go-around of the assessment and treatment process, it may take some more work to inventory exactly what is or is not in place. If there are no existing control documentation, you're going to want to check with the individuals responsible for information security. This could be an IS officer, a building manager, operations managers, IT administrators, etc., to get a comprehensive list of controls already in place. The primary objective of this step is to avoid wasting time and/or money by duplicating controls. After completing this, you should have a list of all existing or planned controls as well as their implementation and usage status. Next, you're going to want to identify any vulnerabilities related to your assets. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses associated with assets or controls that can be exploited by one or more threats. There are a number of resources that can be used to assist with vulnerability identification, including lists of common threats and associated vulnerabilities, automated vulnerability scanners, penetration testing, code review, etc. After performing this step, you should have a list of vulnerabilities in relation to your assets, threats, and existing controls. Now, the standard requires that a risk owner is identified for all risk, and these owners need to have the accountability and authority to manage their identified risks. To summarize, the goal of the identification process is to end up with a complete list of information assets, along with the associated threats and vulnerabilities, and a listing of existing and planned controls as well as their implementation status. By gathering all this information, you will be prepared to perform your risk analysis. Again, there are many methods of risk analysis that can be used, and again, the standard does not require any specific methodology to be employed. But to continue with our example method, the next step would be to identify potential consequences that the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability may have on the assets identified. The consequence could be a loss of effectiveness, adverse operating conditions, loss of business, reputational damage, etc. By taking the list of assets and associated threats and vulnerabilities, scenarios can be drawn up by describing a threat exploiting a vulnerability. The scenario should include operational consequences in terms of investigation and repair time, time lost, opportunity lost, health and safety, financial cost, image, reputation, and goodwill. Depending on which approach your organization has adopted, a qualitative or quantitative analysis methodology may be in place. In short, a qualitative analysis approach will employ a more subjective rating system for potential consequences and likelihoods, such as low, medium, and high, while a quantitative approach will use numerical values for consequences and likelihood. Each approach has its merits and can be effective methods of risk analysis. To determine the level of risk, the consequence and likelihood values are combined to assign a raw risk value. Now at this point, you should have your risks and levels of risk identified. We can now evaluate and prioritize the treatment of them. The standard requires that organizations evaluate their risks by comparing your risk analysis results against the criteria for performing your risk assessment, as well as the risk acceptance criteria that has been determined. The last step in the assessment process is to use the information gathered during the previous steps to make informed decisions and take action. The standard requires that untreated risks that are above and beyond the established acceptable level of risk be treated. Additionally, the risk must be prioritized for treatment. Some additional considerations besides the established acceptable level of risk that may be used include the importance or criticality of the asset the risk is associated with, the degree of confidence in the risk assessment process, as well as any applicable contractual, legal, or regulatory requirements. All right, selecting risk treatment options. Broadly speaking, there are typically 4 options available for treating a risk. Those are avoidance, which is to choose not to take on the risk by avoiding the actions that cause it. Mitigation, which is to take actions that reduce the risk by reducing the likelihood, the consequence, or both. Transfer the risk, which is to transfer, share some or all of the risk to a third party. Or accept the risk, which is to choose to take on the risk as it currently stands. This is common if the evaluated level of risk meets or falls beneath the acceptable level defined without treatment. And again, these 4 options are not mutually exclusive, and it's very common to see a risk be reduced to an acceptable level, at which point it is accepted by the organization. In terms of information security related risks and the requirements of the standard, the primary method of treatment will be the implementation or modification of controls. While the standard requires that you reference the controls in Annex A to ensure that none have been omitted that may be applicable to your system, please remember that you are free to implement controls not already present in Annex A as needed. When selecting controls, you should take into account the risk acceptance criteria established during the risk assessment phase, as well as applicable legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements. While the risk of complying with legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements will typically never be acceptable, for other identified risks, it is expected that the cost of implementing and ongoing maintenance of selected controls will be evaluated against the value of the assets they will protect and overall return on investment. In addition to financial constraints, the following factors should also be taken into consideration when selecting controls. Are there time constraints? For example, the proposed control would take an unacceptable amount of time to be implemented. Technical constraints. The proposed control, for example, would impact the performance of key systems, making them ineffective for business purposes. Operational constraints. For example, a proposed control would require additional oversight and management that cannot be supported. Environmental constraints. For example, a proposed control would require a new facility to accommodate the space requirements. Or a legal constraint. For example, an existing regulation requires data of a certain type to be encrypted in a particular manner. By considering all these factors when selecting controls, you'll be in a good position to have an attainable risk treatment plan put together. Evaluating residual risks. So after you define your treatment plan, you'll need to determine your residual risks, which is obviously the amount of risk that remains after controls have been put in place. This is done through another iteration of the assessment on your identified risks, this time taking into account the expected effects of the proposed treatment. The level of risk expected to still remain after the treatment has been implemented is referred to as the residual risk, as I said. If residual risks exist that do not meet or fall below the established acceptance criteria, most likely you're going to need to go through the risk treatment selection process again in order to find a treatment that will bring that level down to at least your acceptable level of risk. The treatment plan should also include persons responsible for implementation, expected date of completion of the implementation, the current status of the implementation, and must be approved by all identified risk owners, indicating their approval of the plan and acceptance of all expected residual risks. And that obviously is to ensure that the folks who are responsible for managing the risk agree with the plan proposed and the expected outcome of implementing that treatment. Excuse me. And to assess treatment effectiveness, it's going to depend on the nature of the risk being treated. As a simple example, if an identified risk was an unsecured door to an area with sensitive information and was treated by the installation of a lock or card access system, it would be reasonable to see something along the lines of being tested and verified to be working as intended, such as periodically checking to ensure that the door is securely locked. If the risk involved unpatched systems being vulnerable to attack, the evaluation may be a weekly report showing numbers of unpatched systems still in use, and would require ongoing monitoring to determine if the actions being taken are reducing the risk to the required level. Other methods of evaluating treatment effectiveness may include internal or third-party audits, vulnerability scans, penetration tests, reviewing the number of security incidents that have taken place or security events, etc. Regardless of the nature of evaluation, what's critical is that it's being done and the actions are being taken in the event a treatment option is found to be ineffective. Additionally, the status of the risk treatment plan is required to be discussed during the management review as outlined in the standard. All right, that brings us to the end of the presentation, so I'm going to go ahead and open up the questions pane here and see what we have. If you'd like to ask any questions, please feel free at this time, and I will do my best to answer as many as I can. Otherwise, thank you for attending. If you'd like further information regarding becoming 27001 certified, please contact us at 1-800-800-7910. Or if you have any questions that you'd like to ask offline, please feel free to contact me directly. My email address is jlaffey@pjr.com, and that's on the screen right now. All right, and again, thank you very much for joining us today. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and shut it down. But again, everyone, thanks for joining, and please feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions. Have a great day.